In this episode, we're going to look at how we can use Enzyme to test a form built using React.js. So I've built a sign-up form here to my imaginary service where I can enter my name and email, and for some reason I need to tell this service my favourite colour, blue, red or yellow, and I can hit sign up that will make an imaginary HTTP request to my API to sign up this user. If I filled out the form, I can also hit reset to clear and reset everything back to default. Let's look at the component before looking at how we might test it. So here is our form. I've also built a save user function that I'm importing from the API module. In real life, this save user function would make an HTTP request, but all it does for the purposes of demonstration is just return a promise with the user's data and some fake data. There's no actual HTTP request. I then have my set of colors, and I've defined a starting state object which has my name set to an empty string, email the same, and then colors, we pick the first color as the default. Going into my form component, we set the state to be this starting state object. We have a reset function that when called sets the state back to that starting state. We have an update field function which can take a state key, name, email or color, and return an event handler for when that field changes. So when the user types into the name input, for example, we'll set the new state of the name value to be the event.target.value, which is how you reach into a form field to get at the value. We then have the submit form handler. This calls prevent default to stop the form actually refreshing the browser and doing its default action, and then returns a result as saving user, which is our faked API request, where we pass in the name, email, and the color. The render function renders the form, and then three divs with a class of group. We have the name with its input for the name, where the value is this.state.name, and there's that update field being used. We then have similarly for email, and then for favorite color, we render a select, and we map over each color to pull out a list of options. We then have the sign up submit button, and another button that you can click to reset. Let's go and see how we can now start testing this form. So I've implemented a shell here that we can go from, and the first test says it has a default color of blue selected. The first thing to note is that I'm shallow rendering this form again. Shallow rendering only goes one level deep, but that's fine for us because we're rendering just those inputs. There's no other child components going on, so we can use shallow rendering. To check the value of the select, we need to find it. So let's create a constant called color select. And in our case, this will be wrapper.find, and we only have one select, so we can just do find select. If you had multiples, you'd look on this based on an ID or a value on it, something along those lines. You might define a data attribute or a name attribute that you could use to search for a specific select. We need to now pull out the value of the select. Enzyme provides a function called props, which pulls out all the properties of a particular element. That will give us back an object, and we can call dot value on that to give us the actual value we're looking for. So I'm going to expect that the color select dot props dot value will equal the string blue. And you can see that test is still passing. Whenever I've written a test and it immediately passes, I like to go to the implementation and make it break, just to make sure I've written the test that I think I've written. So I've come back into form.js, and I'm going to just change the default color from not being blue to being yellow. And we'll see that that test does indeed fail. We expected blue, but we got yellow. Let's now actually do a test where we fill out the form and then we hit the reset button to clear the form out. So I'm going to copy that first test. I'm going to say it lets me fill out the form and then reset it. And now to change the value of an input, what we actually do is we simulate an on-change event. Our form inputs are controlled inputs. That is that React is controlling the value of them, and it's listening to the on-change event to update the state, which updates the value in the input. So what we now need to do is simulate a change event. So I can say name input.simulate change. And the second argument is the object that represents the event object. So in our real component, we use event.target.value to pull out the value of an input. So we need to mimic that here. So I'll say event, and it has an object called target, which is going to have a value, and we'll set that value to Jack. In here, you might expect that we can now say expect name input.props.value to equal Jack. However, when we run that, you're going to see that that fails. It expected Jack, but it got the empty string. This is because this name input here isn't dynamically updating as we interact with the wrapper. This name input here represents the input at this point in time. At this point in time, we hadn't simulated the change event. So what I'm going to do is change this const to a let, copy it down here, and delete the let. So we'll now simulate the change, re-query the wrapper to find the input, and then check its value. And you'll see now that we do get the right value. What we can do is we can pull out functions to make this easier. So let's pull out a function that lets us pull out an input, simulate a change, and then return the new input with that change applied to it. Before we do that, I'm going to go into the form component and change the inputs to have a class on them so we can select them more easily. And in fact, rather than a class, I'm going to use an ID because that's more appropriate here. So we'll say name-input, and here we'll say ID equals email-input, And for consistency, we'll do it on the select too. So we'll say ID equals color input. So let's pull out a function here called simulate change on input. And it will take the wrapper and it will take the input selector. So this is a CSS selector we'll use to select the input. So what we'll say is we'll say const input is wrapper.find input selector. And actually, we're also going to need to take in the value that we want to change. So we'll say new value. We'll then do an input and we'll simulate a change event. And we'll say it's event.target, where the value will be this new value, like so. And again, I'm going to change that const to a let. And then what we need to do is we're just going to return the result of finding that input again. So we'll simulate the change and we'll return back the new input. So I can say const updated name input, and this will be the result of calling simulate change on input with the wrapper, input with an ID of name input, and the new value should be Jack. And we can still now expect, and we'll just update this reference here to be the updated name input. You can see that that's still passing, but now it's a bit clearer what's going on. We've also got this let that we don't need anymore. Particularly when you're testing forms, you'll find yourself writing a lot of code to update values in a lot of different inputs. So putting out little functions like this makes it much easier to do that. So what we'll do is I'm going to delete this assertion and we're going to run this simulate change on input a few different times, once for each of the fields we have. We're actually not even going to care about the result, so I'm just going to delete that variable. So we're going to do the same, replacing name with email. And I'll do this Jack at, let's just do test.com. And we're going to do the same on the select as well. And these work exactly the same. You still trigger the same events despite them being a select rather than a text input. This is the color input, and we'll go for yellow. And you can see we've got an error here. Simulate is only meant to be run on a single node, not found instead. That's because this input color input selector is incorrect. It's just color input. And actually, because these are IDs, we'll clean those up for each one of these calls. So you can see the benefit here of pulling out that function, because it's now really clear as a person reading the test what's going on here. We're going into the wrapper, updating each of these fields to be a particular value. And now our test is going to be that we can reset the form and check that all the values are blank. But before we check that they're blank, we probably do want to assert that the right values have been placed into the form to begin with. Else what we could have is a broken form that doesn't ever update any of the inputs, and our test would still pass because it would say that we click the reset button and the form is blank, but we never asserted that the form wasn't blank as we filled in the values. So I'm going to say const name input here, and we'll do the same here for the email input, and down here we'll say color input. And I'm going to expect name input.props.value to equal Jack. I'm going to repeat this with the email input, which should equal Jack at test.com. And I'm also going to do the same thing with the color input, which should equal yellow. And I save that there, and we just checked all the tests are still passing. So now what we need to do is find the reset button. Now there are two buttons in the form. There's the submit button and there's the reset button. We can actually query these without having to add an extra selector, because the submit button has a type of submit and the other button has a type of button. So I'm going to say const reset button is wrapper.find button, and we can say here type equals button. And what we now want to say is reset button.simulate click. I'm just going to save that. None of our assertions have changed, but by saving that I've checked that we are finding a button and that we can click it. Because if that query was wrong and it didn't find a button, just an Enzyme would fail, because Enzyme would be trying to click on a button that we couldn't find. So now what we need to do is pull out the value of the name, email, and color input and check that they're the right value, which in our case should be empty string for name and email, and blue the default for the color. So what we'll say is we'll expect wrapper.find name input .props.value to equal empty string. And that's passing. And we'll repeat this here. We'll say email input and we'll say color input. And the color input one fails because the actual value should be blue. And now those are all passing. So our test is now correct. We are filling out the form, checking the values there and resetting it, but it feels very verbose to me. This is a very long test. What we're actually seeing here is this would be better off as two tests. One that checks I can fill in the form and another that checks I can then reset it. So let's break this apart into two smaller tests. So I'm going to say it lets me fill out the form with values. And we'll basically stop that test here. We'll then create another test that says it lets me click the reset button to clear the form. So I'm going to go up here and I'm still going to find this code because I still want to do that. I still need to render the wrapper and fill in the inputs, like so. But now the difference is I'm not going to make any assertions about them. So I'm just going to simulate a click event and check that the form is back to D. And clearly I've made a little bit of a syntactical error. I've got a random parentheses there I don't need. But once we fix that, we can see that all our tests are passing. You might be thinking that these tests are verbose, and they are. Unfortunately, form tests are always going to be quite verbose. When you've got to find a lot of inputs, fill in values, and query them, it does take a bit of code to do that. Just remember that you can pull out functions at any point to clear up the code and make it a bit clearer what's going on. For the final test, let's check we can submit the form with valid values and that our API returns a valid message. So I'm going to grab this test where we fill out the form values. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to come down to the bottom here and paste it in. So I'll say it submits the form to the API. I'm now going to go up here and import my API. Because we're now going to be using a jest spy, I need to do my jest.resetAllMocks call between each test to make sure none of them live past one test. So I'll say before each jest.resetAllMocks. So in here we're going to say jest.spyOn API, and the function is called saveUser. And we will mock this to return something. Although saveUser actually isn't making an HTTP request because it's just a demo function, in reality it would be, so I'm still going to mock it as if it was. So we'll say mock implementation, and I'm just going to return a promise. And let's say it will resolve with an object that has message of saved user. I'm just using this resolve with a message to demonstrate what you do if you had an API that maybe returned certain status codes based on if the user was successfully saved or not. You could mock those by using this. So you might resolve with a message error or saved user, and then you can test success and error states. Now we've got that, we're going to render the form, fill in the values. We're not going to make any assertions on them. A previous test is doing that for us. So now what we can do is we can say const submit button equals wrapper.find button where the type is submit. And we can call submit button.simulate click. At this point, we'll expect save user to have been called. I'm sorry, it's not save user, it's api.saveuser. Now, you were probably expecting that test to pass, but you can see here we're getting an error that it's expecting the mock function to have been called, but it wasn't. And this is because we're simulating a click on the submit button. And in real life, that would cause the form to submit, and it would trigger a submit event on the form. But because under test, we just simulate the events we want to happen, we don't want to simulate a click on the button, we want to simulate the submit event on the actual form itself. So we can just say here, wrapper.find form.simulate submit. And you can see we now get this other error, cannot read property prevent default of undefined. That's because in our form event handler, we're calling event.prevent default to prevent the default action. So we need to provide that function in test just to make sure it can still call it. Remember, the second argument to simulate is the event object. So I'll just define this prevent default function and it will just do nothing. But that means it exists and our React component will still call it. You can see now that this is now passing. But as always, this isn't the most explicit test. To have been called only checks that we've called it, doesn't check that we called it with the right data. So let's replace it with to have been called with, and we expect it to be called with Jack at test.com, and then our color of yellow. And you can see that that test is still passing, and now we've successfully covered our React form in a bunch of tests that make sure we can fill it in, clear it out, and send data to our API.